Hello and welcome to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. This is going to be our first of many podcasts where we're going to talk about animals. The purpose of this first video podcast is to introduce you to animals and some of their features. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the phylogenetics of animals, and then talk about some common characteristics we see in animals, and then I'm going to list several of the different phyla of animals. Let's go ahead and begin by talking about the phylogenies of animals. Alright, so if we look at this phylogenetic tree here, let me remind you of a few things. The first, remember that one of the eukaryotic groups that we talked about earlier in the semester were the epistocants, right here. And this group includes the fungi, the animals, as well as this protist called the choanoflagellates. So these are all related because they share a common ancestor right here. So the epistocants are indeed a monophyletic group, but are they animals? And it turns out that the animals are indeed a monophyletic group. This phylogenetic tree doesn't show it, but we'll see it on the next slide and throughout the next few weeks. But the animals are broken up into many different phyla of animals. Now, depending on which book you look at or which biologist you talk to, you might see as many as 30 to 35 different phyla. Your book lists about 28 of these. But we're going to focus primarily on 12 different phyla, but recognize that we're not going to cover them all. The next question I want to ask is, which group of organisms living today would animals be most similar to? So we can go back here, and we can see that animals and the choanoflagellates share a common ancestor here. So we would predict that animals and choanoflagellates, the protist, are more similar to each other than the animals would be to fungi or any other organism. If that's true, then one might predict that one of the early animals that first evolved might be pretty similar to what we see in the modern day choanoflagellates. So let's go ahead and look at some of these different phyla of animals and see if one of them is more similar to the choanoflagellates, which would support that choanoflagellates is the most recent relative of the animals, and it would also suggest that that particular animal was one of the first animals to have evolved. So on the last slide, what we saw was an expansion of this simple phylogenetic tree up here on the left. And what we're doing here in the rest of this figure here is we're blowing up the animals into these different phyla. And we can see that one of these synaptomorphies that we see in all animals is that they're multicellular. So we'll talk about this in a moment when we talk about the different characteristics of animals, but all animals are multicellular. And there are morphological and molecular data that suggests that the porifera, that is the sponges, were the first animals to have evolved. And so it is a sister group with the rest of the animals. So let's talk a little bit more about those morphological and genomic pieces of evidence that support porifera, or the sponges, as being the first animal that evolved. So let's talk about some of this evidence. And we're going to start with the morphological. The first piece of evidence is that choanoflagellates and sponges are benthic. And I'm just going to abbreviate the choanoflagellates as CF. So as I said, the choanoflagellates and sponges are benthic. And what I mean by benthic is that they live at the bottom of an aquatic environment. They are non-modal. The next piece of morphological data is that both choanoflagellates and sponges feed in a similar way. Now the choanoflagellates, they look something like this, with a flagella on them. And when they feed, they will all come together. So it might look something like this. And the beating of their flagella will bring water in a current through them, like so. In doing so, any food particle that is near will get pushed through the choanoflagellates, and they will be able to digest the nutrients. Now remember, what we're looking at here with the choanoflagellates are unicellular organisms, but they work in this colony. Now the sponges are multicellular, and as part of this multicellular organism, we see specialized cells all around the inside of the sponge. And they're going to do a very similar thing. They're going to beat their flagella, and in doing so, it will create a water current pushing water through the sponge. And just like with the chonoflagellates, any nutrients that happen to be in the water here will get pushed through the sponge and digested within the inside of the sponge. So in this way, they're feeding in a very similar way. In fact, because of their similarity, these specialized cells in the sponge we call chonocytes. So these are two pieces of morphological evidence that suggest that the sponges are very similar to the chonoflagellates, the protist, which suggests two things. One, it suggests that the chonoflagellates are related to the animals, and it also suggests that the sponge is likely one of the first animals that evolved because of its similarity to our recent ancestor, the chonoflagellates. Next, let's think about genomic evidence. Simply put, the DNA evidence suggests that the sponges were one of the first animals. And also the closest common relative of the chonoflagellates. Remember that the closer the DNA sequence is between two organisms suggests that they are more closely related. Now remember, even though the sponges are closely related to the protists, the chonoflagellates, they are still indeed animals. And because of that, they do have a complex set of genes that allow them to be animals. That is, they have genes that allow them to be multicellular. And so let's just list a few of these here. Some of them will be review. They have the ability to have specialized cells. They have the ability to regulate cell growth. They can adhere to other cells. They have an extracellular matrix. They have the genes that allow them to have innate immunity. What I mean by innate immunity is that they can tell the difference between self cells, that is cells that belong to them, versus non-self cells. So this is really important if they're going to have some kind of response to cells that may damage the sponge. They have a complex way of gene regulation. And this is really important during the development of animals. And the last one here, I'm going to have to sneak it up here, is that they can undergo programmed cell death. Or we might call this apoptosis. An animal doesn't want their cells to live forever. They do need the cells to turn over. So under some circumstances, the cells are programmed to die. And this is important for all animals. So the take-home point from this is that sponges contain the genes that allow the sponges to do all these things, which is consistent with what other animals can do. It was first formed here in the sponges. All right, let's move to our second objective for today's video, and that is, let's talk about some animal characteristics. When I covered the first objective, I mentioned some of these, but it bears repeating so you have a nice cohesive list here. And the first characteristic I'm going to list is that all animals are multicellular. This allows for cell specialization, allows the animals to be bigger, allows them to live longer, and the other features that we talked about when we discussed the advantages of being multicellular. The next characteristic is that they don't have a cell wall, so no cell wall. However, they do have an extracellular matrix. Remember, we've talked about the extracellular matrix before, but remember, it's important for structural support, cell adhesion, and cell-to-cell communication. Another characteristic shared by all animals is that they are heterotrophs. Just like the fungi, there are no animals that are able to undergo photosynthesis. So they are not autotrophs. All of them are heterotrophs, meaning that they have to consume their nutrients. A fourth common characteristic is that they are able to move, at least at some point in their life. All right, I'm going to list three more characteristics, and these next three are found in all animals except the sponges. And the first one is that they have neurons. and either an advanced or primitive nervous system. They also have a muscular system. Having a nervous system and a muscular system really aids in their ability to move under their own power. And they all, except the sponges, undergo sexual reproduction. So as a reminder, this is true of all animals except the sponges. Okay, let's go ahead and work on this last objective. In this objective, I'm going to talk about several different phyla of animals and provide some examples of each. Now, we have thrown the word phylum or phyla around a few times this semester, but what is a phylum? Phylum is singular, phyla is plural. And in essence, a phylum is a taxonomic category that is below the category of kingdom. A kingdom, in this example here, would be animals. Animals are a kingdom. So all I mean by phylum are the different groups of animals that have similar characteristics, and we're going to put them together. So let's go ahead and talk about these 12 or so phyla that I want you to know. I'm going to move to a PowerPoint slide so you can see some examples of them. All right, so these are going to be the different phyla that I'm going to talk about. I should also point out that throughout the next several days of the semester, we're going to talk about many of these in a little bit more detail. So this is just to give you a brief introduction to the different phyla. First is the phylum Porifera, the sponges. And we've already talked about this group because this was the group that is the first of the animals. They are all aquatic, as you see here, and there are many different varieties of them. You should know both the phylum Porifera and the examples of sponges. Next is the phylum Ctenophora. You should know the phylum Ctenophora plus the example of comb jellies. And you can see an example down here. As you're looking at this comb jelly, you can see all these structures moving here and flapping. These are cilia. And these are cilia that are used to help the comb jellies move. Also, all the species of the comb jellies are aquatic and live in marine environments. Okay, the next phylum I would like you to know are the cnidarians, shown here. And there are 4 types of cnidarians I'd like you to know. I would like you to know that what we see here are corals and sea anemones. They happen to be in the group of Anthozoa, but if I refer to these, I'm going to refer to them as corals and sea anemones. You've no doubt seen pictures of these in movies, or maybe some of you have been fortunate enough to scuba dive on coral reefs where you've been able to see some of these up close. You should also know this other example of jellyfish. So here's a jellyfish, and you have probably seen pictures of these as well, and maybe you've seen them up close, and I hope you've never been stung by them, but perhaps some of you have been stung by a jellyfish. If I ask you anything about this group here, I will use the term jellyfish. The next example are the box jellies. They look similar to the jellyfish, but they are a little different. And if I ask you about these, I will ask you about box jellies and not cubozoa. Our last example here are the hydras. And if I ask you anything about this group, I will refer to them as the hydras. So you need to know the corals and sea anemones, the jellyfish, and box jellies are all examples of cnidarians. Here you see the phylum Rotifera. And the example I want you to know are rotifers. And you can see cilia here on the ends of them that are helping them feed, pushing nutrients and food into their bodies. The next phylum I'd like you to know are the Platyhelminths. Now this is an important phylum to remember because most of the members of this phylum, the phylum of Platyhelminths, are parasitic. So here are the examples you need to know. You need to know planaria. You also need to know tapeworms. And these tapeworms, these are certainly an example of a parasitic Platyhelminths, and they can be anywhere from 4 to 28 inches long. The last one you should know are the flukes, shown here. Now, I should have said this in the beginning when I introduced Platyhelminths, but you should know that all of the worms in this group are what we call flatworms. So in the phylum Annelida, we have these 3 examples I would like you to know. I'd like you to know the first one of bristlesworms, and here are some pictures of them, and then the earthworms, shown in this picture, and then finally the leeches. And leeches have a great history as being used for medicinal purposes and other interesting things. The next phylum you need to know are the mollusks. These include several that you are probably familiar with. In this one here, I would like you to know both the fact that they are bivalvia or just simply bivalves, and this includes the clams, oysters, and mussels. So I'd like you to know these examples within this group of bivalvia, or as I said, you can just call them bivalves. That would be fine as well. The gastropoda, shown here, represent the snails and slugs, and you should know all three of these terms. The cephalopods represent the octopi and the squids. So the octopus is up here, and the squid is down here. You should know cephalopod as well as octopi or octopus and squids. And this last one here, you should know that they represent a group called the chitons. Here we see the phylum Nematoda, and these represent the roundworms. This one in particular is a microscopic one called C. elegans that is used commonly in research. The next phylum you need to know are the arthropoda. You should know that these include millipedes and centipedes, so you need to know those two words. And these are representatives of the millipedes and the centipedes. You also need to know that the arthropods include the insects, shown here. You should know that the arthropods include the group of the crustaceans, shrimp, lobsters, crabs, and copepods. And lastly, some of our favorites, the spiders, the scorpions, ticks, and mites. Alright, just two more phylum to go. This one here are the echinoderms, and you need to know these 5 different groups. And you should know one of those are the feather star and sea lilies, shown here. The sea stars, which you likely have seen before. The next one are the bursal stars. The next ones that you should know are the sea urchins, shown here, and then the sand dollars. The last one you need to know are the sea cucumbers. These sea cucumbers, if they get frightened or you disturb them, they may secrete a very thick substance. And typically it's not dangerous, but if you get it in your eye, then it can be quite dangerous. And so dangerous that it could lead to blindness. So a pro tip here is do not scare a sea cucumber. They look relatively harmless, but they could make you go blind. And we'll talk about this phylum towards the end of the semester, but all members of chordata have a nerve cord. So you should know these different groups of chordates. The lancelets, the tunicates, one of my favorites, the lamprey, and next are the sharks, skates, and rays. All members of sharks, skates, and rays have a skeleton, but it's not a bony skeleton. It is a cartilage-based skeleton. Then we start moving into animals that have bony skeleton, such as the ray-finned fish that we see here. You should know amphibians, and you should know that amphibians include organisms like frogs, toads, and salamanders. Next, you should know reptiles, and you should know some examples of reptiles. They include lizards, snakes, turtles, alligators, crocodiles, and birds. And lastly, you should know your home phylum, the mammals. I didn't list examples here, but I'm pretty sure you know several examples. Here, though, of course, we have the panda, the koala, a monkey, and everyone's favorite, the duck-billed platypus. Everyone loves Perry the platypus. Okay, that is all I have for this video. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you come see me or send me an email. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.